It took just 10 minutes for him to be found guilty of murder. It would be another 70 years before his conviction was vacated. Hello everyone, my name is Anya, and in this video we're going to take a look at what happened on this day in the year 1944, the execution of George Stinney. Before we look into what happened to George Stinney, it's important to take a look at what happened on the 23rd of March 1944, when the bodies of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames were found in a ditch in Alcaloo, South Carolina. Both young girls had suffered a horrific death. They had been beaten severely with a heavy blunt instrument, and it was determined that they had died as a result of trauma to the head. Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were last seen the day before on their bicycles looking for flowers. It's known that they stopped at the house where 14-year-old George Stinney lived with his parents and siblings. The two girls spoke to George and his sister, asking if they knew any area where they could find maypop flowers. When the two girls failed to return home that evening, police were called and a search began that lasted into the following morning. When law enforcement officers learned that George Stinney was the last known person to have spoken to the girls, they arrived at his house, where they arrested George, handcuffed him, and brought him to the station. For hours, George was forced to endure extremely harsh interrogation from the officers. He received no help or support from any lawyers, and the officers did their best to force him into a confession. Finally, after several hours, an officer claimed that George Stinney had confessed to the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. Owing to fears of being lynched by an angry mob, George Stinney's family were forced to flee from their home in the middle of the night. This meant that George received no help or support from the time of his arrest up to the day of his trial. In a trial that lasted just 2.5 hours, where no African Americans were allowed to be present, the court-appointed attorney did absolutely nothing to help his client. He did not call on any witnesses and didn't provide any evidence that could clear George's name. The only evidence against George Stinney was his alleged confession to the murders, except there is no written record that he had confessed to the crime. Regardless, it took an all-white jury just 10 minutes to find 14-year-old George Stinney guilty of the murders of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames. On the 24th of April 1944, he was sentenced to death. Despite pleas for clemency from George's family, churches and the NAACP, on the 16th of June 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney was executed in the electric chair. He was so small that he had to be boosted up into the chair with a Bible. In the space of just 83 days, George Stinney had been arrested, tried, found guilty, and executed. It was not until 2014, 70 years after his death, that the charges against George Stinney were overturned. Thanks to years of campaigning from his siblings, the original charge against George Stinney was overturned and his conviction was vacated on the grounds that he had not received a fair trial. To this day, 14-year-old George Stinney remains the youngest person to ever be found guilty and executed in the United States throughout the 20th century. This is a case that shows the problems with racism and discrimination. It took 10 minutes for an all-white jury to find George Stinney guilty of murder. It would take another 70 years for his conviction to finally be vacated. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. My name is Anya, and we just looked at what happened on this day.